Hello, Mr. Leon. I'm Associate Sarah Cyber. Ms. Wainwright asked that I record this video voicemail to provide you with important information on a pending lawsuit against the firm's client, Shogun Motors of America Inc., or SMA. SMA is a U.S. distributor of a Japanese manufacturer who produces Jushi model sport utility vehicles. John Lee Turnbull bought a Jushi vehicle from SMA, and a few days later, he and his vehicle were involved in a single-car accident in which the car rolled over. This accident resulted in the death of Gordon Gillespie, the passenger in Mr. Turnbull's vehicle. Mr. Gillespie's parents had brought a wrongful death action against SMA, alleging that the Jushi was unreasonably dangerous due to a design defect that caused it to roll over in routine driving conditions. SMA's defense will be that the rollover was due to driver error rather than to any defect in the Jushi design. The only information that has been provided comes from an audio recording of Joel Gardner. Joel Gardner is a motorist who came upon the accident scene and stopped to render aid. Mr. Gardner stated that as he came upon the car, it was obvious that an accident occurred. He said that it was obvious that an accident had occurred because of the skid marks on the road. He also said that it was obvious that the car had rolled over due to how crumpled up the vehicle was and the gouges in the dirt and the sod on the side of the road, but that somehow the vehicle had landed right side up. Mr. Gardner determined that the accident could not have occurred long before he arrived because of one of the tires on the vehicle was still spinning because it was propped up on uneven ground. Mr. Gardner stopped his vehicle, making sure to turn his hazards on to warn approaching vehicles of the situation. Before exiting his vehicle, Mr. Gardner called 911 to inform dispatch that there had been an accident with injuries involving 2 passengers and that an ambulance would be required. At this time, Mr. Gardner approached the wrecked vehicle, which he was able to identify as a Jushi sport utility vehicle from the driver's side. Upon approaching the vehicle, Mr. Gardner was able to see a young man, later identified as John Lee Turnbull, behind the wheel. Mr. Turnbull had visible injuries and was unconscious but breathing. Mr. Gardner then proceeded to the passenger side of the vehicle where he found Gordon Gillespie, who was also later identified. Mr. Gardner stated that he could tell from looking at Mr. Gillespie that he was already gone, but he leaned into the smashed window of the vehicle to feel for a pulse on Mr. Gillespie's neck to be sure that he really was deceased. Mr. Gardner could not find a pulse and determined that Mr. Gillespie was deceased. It was later shown by autopsy results that Mr. Gillespie was killed on impact. Knowing that there was nothing that could be done for Mr. Gillespie, Mr. Gardner returned to the driver's side where Mr. Turnbull was to see what he could do to help Mr. Turnbull while he waited for the ambulance to arrive. As Mr. Gardner returned to Mr. Turnbull began to regain consciousness. Mr. Gardner tried to reassure Mr. Turnbull that everything was going to be all right. Mr. Gardner told Mr. Turnbull that he needed to try and stay still and be calm, and that an ambulance was on the way to take him to the hospital. Mr. Turnbull began to panic, stating he could not feel his legs and was worried that this meant he was going to die. He stated that it was stupid to die for such a reason because he wasn't that late and that he should not have been driving half as fast as he had been on the wet roads. Mr. Gardner again tried to comfort Mr. Turnbull by telling him that the sirens he could hear in the distance would be the ambulance coming to help and that they would be there soon. Mr. Gardner told Mr. Turnbull that he believed that he would be at the emergency room within 30 minutes of the accident and that he would make a full recovery. Mr. Turnbull also stated that he was not a doctor and that his determination of the full recovery was based off of previous injuries that he saw that were similar to Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Gardner said these things with the hope that it would calm Mr. Turnbull down, at least until the ambulance arrived, but it did not calm Mr. Turnbull down. At the mention of an ambulance, Mr. Turnbull began to panic. Mr. Turnbull was no longer focused on his fear of dying or being unable to feel his legs, but began to panic because he believed that the doctors would check his blood alcohol level upon his arrival at the hospital. Mr. Turnbull asked Mr. Gardner if he believed that it would be checked, and Mr. Gardner told Mr. Turnbull that he believed it would be checked, that he did think it would be checked. Mr. Turnbull pled with Mr. Gardner that if his blood alcohol level were checked, tell the doctors at the hospital that he had drank all the alcohol right before he had gotten into the car, and that it could not have had time to get into his bloodstream before the accident occurred. Mr. Turnbull then made the comment that he would bet that there would be plenty of bourbon in his bloodstream by the time he got to the emergency room because of the amount of time that would have elapsed from the accident and his arrival there. After this conversation, Mr. Turnbull lost consciousness and fell into a coma that doctors are unsure he will come out of. This would be the last conversation that Mr. Turnbull would have with anyone, and the only conversation in regards to the events surrounding the accident. Mr. Gardner's hearsay conversation is all that the firm has to base their defense off of. Mr. Leon, I hope that the information that has been provided to you is sufficient enough to support SMA's defense and the pending wrongful death action lawsuit against them.